local control. And for that purpose, our planning committee has put together this fine panel. They have a presentation prepared, and then I'm sure they're going to answer your questions to the best of their abilities. This is weird because you're looking at me. But first, we have Peter Schneeberger. He was born and raised in Columbia, and after working abroad for a number of years, he's back. He's been engaged with the Boone County Democratic Party since last May and is passionate about democracy and the environment. We've also got Karl Skala. Before retirement, he was a researcher at the MU School of Veterinary Medicine, and he served for 12 years as the council member representing my ward, Columbia's 3rd Ward. And his lovely wife, Mahree, whom we recently at Muleskinners recognized with a Lifetime Achievement Award. She worked in public health and serves our community in many ways. Just a few of them: she is on the Boone County Board of Health, she works with the League of Women Voters, and she is an officer in our group. So I'm going to switch the camera view back over to the sweet little owl so you can see and hear them better, and turn it over to our panel. And we're good.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for juggling all this technology. Can you hear me okay?
Dave, how's that sound?
Yes,
okay,
that's
Dave?
perfect. Absolutely
great. He says great. Okay.
Well, this sounds like kind of an arcane subject, local control and preemption, but it's a very important one. And what really got me started on this and wanting to share this with Muleskinners is a study group that was formed by the League of Women Voters Columbia Boone County chapter, which produced a report on preemption and developed a position which we have adopted locally and will be asking the state league to also adopt regarding preemptive laws. And so I want to give credit where credit's due. If you can, the slides are not showing for
ready? You ready?
The audience. Okay. Go back to the beginning, and you can go to the next one. Just want to give credit where credit is due. The study group members who helped develop this report are shown here, and several of them are also Muleskinners members. So appreciated all the input. We could not have done it without all those different areas of expertise being represented. Why did we do this? Well, the league has a process by which they develop issue statements that then allow the league to educate and inform legislators regarding issues. And so it's kind of a formal process, and we decided we wanted to know what we were talking about. It's very easy to say, oh, well, we're just against preemption. But as we found, as we did the study, that it's not quite as simple as that. So the distribution of power among the different levels of government has been disputed. It's been contended legally throughout U.S. history, and it involves, of course, all levels of government. But it seems like recently there's been a real surge in our state legislature and others around the country to pass laws that directly preempt powers that were previously granted to local governments, or to stipulate things that local governments would have been able to regulate or pass ordinances about taking that away. So that's why we decided we needed to do this study and develop a position. And just to say up front, the main findings of the league study are that we believe that state and federal legislation should provide a floor for local policies, a minimum standard, but not a ceiling that prohibits local governments from policy innovation and testing. So the implications of that, I think, will be more apparent when we talk about specific laws that are in play. But just to give a simple example, take the minimum wage. Missouri has a requirement for a state minimum wage, which is not very generous. And when St. Louis attempted to raise the minimum wage for the city of St. Louis, the legislature preempted that process and passed a law saying no locals can pass higher minimum wage than what the state has. So in that case, they set a ceiling above which locals cannot go. Just to define preemption, when it's basically whenever a higher level of government passes a law that overrules authority at a lower level. So the federal government can preempt state and local law, and the parameters of that are really contained within the Constitution and testable that way in the courts. And then states can preempt county and local ordinances, and that depends on the state constitutions, as we'll see. There are several different types of preemption. I talked about ceiling and floor. I'm not going to go into the definitions of express versus implied prevention, but it's just kind of what it sounds like. Express prevention is when they write a law that says everybody's going to do this and no local government can pass any other rule pertaining to this. An example of that would be taxing alcohol sales and licensing the sale of alcohol. That's a state function, unstated very explicitly there. Implied preemption is when state passes a body of law that where they pretty much take over all the aspects of a given issue and don't leave any room for the for the locals to regulate it any further. So local control, go on to the next one. Yeah, local control has always been a principle of United States democratic governance, in the sense that the United States was formed from separate colonial entities that banded together to make a republic, but they very jealously guarded the power of the states to do lots of things. And that's what local control means in the US, in terms of the context of the US Constitution. That the federal government can only tell the states what to do within certain parameters. But there's always been that tension about where's the borderline there? What are the rights of states compared to the rights of the federal government? And it's constantly tested in the courts, and at one point in a war between the states. And the big gap is that the US Constitution does not address local government powers. It doesn't say anything about local governments. So that has to be regulated either by state constitutions or by what they call case law, which if anybody needs an explanation of that, Leslie can probably give that much better than I can. But basically, it's court decisions that become precedent for then later court decisions that creates a whole body of law that was never expressly stipulated. And if we go on to the next slide, the Dillon rule has been the sort of governing body of law related to local powers since 1868, when these parameters were set by Judge John Dillon of Iowa. And of course, there's been cases building on that since then, but he made a very narrow interpretation of local governmental authority because of the lack of any specifics in the US Constitution. And basically his ruling was that any sub-state government can only engage in an activity if it is specifically sanctioned by the state government. So legislative permission was required for cities or counties to do literally anything. And this was true in Missouri for a period of time. And I saw an example of it recently reading a history of my hometown, Fulton, Missouri, when they first decided that they wanted to pave the streets around the courthouse because the horses were kicking up too much mud and all that. And the local merchants wanted paved streets. They wanted to be a modern town with paved streets. They had to get the state legislature to pass a law saying that they could levy a fee on the merchants to pave the streets. So it as the nation became more populous and more complicated, and it just became impossible for state legislatures to decide every little thing in every little town in the state. So Missouri became actually the first state to establish what's called home rule in our Constitution. Believe it or not, we were first at something. Home rule specifies limits on state interference in local affairs and delegates power from the state to local governments. And each state defines that differently in their own constitutions. So home rule in Missouri is different from what home rule means in Iowa or Massachusetts or whatever. But we were the first to have that incorporated in our Constitution. And that it allows local governments to establish a home rule charter via a vote of the people. So City of Columbia has a home rule charter. We call it Charter City. And that was established in 1949, and it's been revised a few times since then. Boone County, on the other hand, does not have home rule. It's been on the ballot twice in my adult memory, and both times it failed. So Boone County is still subject to the Dillon rule, basically. They can't legislate, do any ordinances that are not specifically authorized by state government. And the way that has shown up, or the example that comes to my mind is with respect to regulation of rental properties. The city can set up standards for rental houses or apartments or whatever, and do inspections and enforce those standards. The county had no such authority until very recently. They've been lobbying state government for years to try to get that authority granted, because there's a lot of really substandard housing in the county. But they finally got a law through, but it's very minimal. It's like fire inspections, and it has to have a roof on it or something. It's very, very minimal standards. So they're still kind of suffering from that lack of home rule in that one respect. But that's only one example. I mean, there are lots of areas in which Boone County might want to do something, but they just can't without the passage of a state law. So, well, why is preemption even an issue? Why don't we just let the state, in its wisdom, decide how to do things? Note there's laughter.
A lot of laughter in the room.
Peter pointed out that we are cloaked in the flag behind us here, which is kind of ironic. But well, obviously, many aspects of life can differ among local jurisdictions. Geography is a plain example. You know, Missouri is an incredibly diverse state geographically. We've got just about everything you can imagine except high mountains. And that means that environmental resources and hazards differ from one area to another. My favorite example from my public health background is water supply. There are areas of the state, especially in southwest Missouri, where their water supplies come from surface water. They have reservoirs that collect rainwater from a watershed. And so they really want to be able to tightly regulate what goes on in that watershed to keep their water supplies for the municipalities clean and pure. And their needs may be very different from communities that draw their water supplies from a deep well or from the river or whatever. So that's just one example. Economic and social and market conditions obviously vary a lot from one part of the state to another. If we go back to the minimum wage example, why do people in St. Louis need a higher minimum wage than people in wherever, Oz? Because the cost of living is higher there. And one standard trying to fit all those needs doesn't fit. And then constituents have concerns about particular issues. Obviously, Peter's going to talk a little later about all the ways that preemption is impacting our environment. Columbia and Boone County especially Columbia, is pretty progressive with respect to environmental issues, or has been. And our citizens might back an initiative to, for example, ban plastic bags, which Karl's or put a price on plastic bags, which Karl's going to talk about a little bit later. Whereas another locality wouldn't do that, but again, that's preempted. So local laws and policies can be more effective than one-size-fits-all solutions in these and other situations. But local regulations may conflict with the state government's philosophy or priorities. And in recent years, the state government's primary priority has been to respond to the needs of and protect businesses. And so this is where the conflict comes in very often. Balance is really important. we've got to think about the pros and cons of preemption, because there are pros, believe it or not. But the underlying question is just how can state and local governments best meet the needs of the communities and the people that we serve? And the pros for preemption mainly relate, the things I can come up with relate to the federal government and the way it has preempted local efforts to take away people's rights. So anything like the Voting Rights Act, the major environmental legislation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water, things like that preempt, allowing, they set a floor below which localities are not supposed to go. But without those things, where would we be really? And well, I know where we would be at this point. I mean, I have my suspicions. Roe v. Wade being one example of something that was never codified and therefore was able to be taken away. But there is a constitutional argument. I mean, it's true that the U.S. Constitution doesn't mention local levels of government. It gives a lot of power to the states, if a particular state doesn't explicitly cede power to localities in some way, then people can argue that that's the way it has to be under the Constitution. The other main pro argument for state preemption, the thing that people tout, is that patchwork regulations can be potentially harmful to businesses. And so if they're listening to the folks who say, well, we don't want to pay a different wage to our McDonald's employees in St. Louis than we do in Columbia, than we do in Kansas City, or if they're talking about things like any kind of environmental regulations on manufacturing, that they don't want to have to deal with localities. We've seen this with the taxation structure too. It's the whole thing about allowing or not allowing localities to tax internet sales. So that's one argument that people make in favor of preemption. And then the other thing we have to realize is that local regulations can hamper distributed systems, things like the power grid or the rivers. If every locality was empowered to outlaw power lines or whatever it is, component of the electric grid, then we wouldn't have an electric grid. So that's an argument in favor of preemption. But the cons are in many cases outweigh those pros. The cons include the demonstrated effectiveness of local variation. All the things I've talked about before, about how different localities are different in many economic ways and geographic ways. And when localities are allowed to be innovative, they can come up with solutions that would never get thought of or implemented at a statewide level. So they can test new approach. We can test new approaches at the local level, and local laws are relatively more nimble. If we try something locally and it doesn't work or people hate it, then it can be rescinded more easily than trying to get something statewide rescinded. And then spillover effect is really important. And I have some references. The report has references that explain some of these things in more detail. But spillover effect means that while one area may legislate, put in place regulations to do things differently, then other areas and or businesses can observe that and say, oh gosh, that's working really well here, so let's do that at our plant over here, or let's do that in another city. And they may do that without even implementing laws and ordinances. They may just adopt those practices because they've been demonstrated to be effective. And there are a number of examples of that, but I won't go into them. I also want to point out that balance is really important here because, or one thing that demonstrates that is that these decisions may or may not reflect partisan disagreements. A lot of them do. A lot of them do. A lot of it is a difference in philosophy of government. But I found it very interesting in some of the current arguments that are going on in the legislature and recent past ones that it's not a partisan disagreement. The one example that Peter's going to give you more information about is the CAFO regulations, combined animal feeding operations. The legislature has now completely preempted that from local control. The county commissioners who took that to the Supreme Court were Republicans. They fought that to the Missouri Supreme Court because they value local control, and they consider local control to be at the county level, not the state level. So another example recently is they're debating prohibiting businesses from requiring vaccinations for their employees. And of course, this is aimed at the COVID vaccine, but they've had the Chamber of Commerce and the Association of Manufacturers have testified against this because they feel like it should be they should have the authority to require hepatitis B vaccine for hospital employees, for example, or a rabies vaccine for people who are working with wildlife or whatever it is, as well as the COVID vaccine. So it's not a Republican v. Democrat thing, at least not all the time. It really is a struggle over what level of government is appropriate to regulate a certain thing. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter, who's going to tell us about how this impacts environmental law.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mahree. You've laid out a nice framework for talking about preemption, and I'll try to put some specifics in place. So you've already talked about CAFOs and that this is very much a nonpartisan issue. That we can talk about school vouchers, where a lot of Republican counties don't want school vouchers, and the state government is trying to move that direction. But because these are small districts, if they lose any of their students to private schools, their local school districts will be in real trouble. So there are issues around preemption from a nonpartisan perspective. It's not a partisan issue necessarily. It is also a partisan issue. And let's talk about building codes. And HB 580 has recently passed the House in the Missouri legislature. What would HB 480 do? It will say the maximum standards. She talked about floors and ceilings. It's going to set a ceiling on building codes across Missouri. And the ceiling they're proposing is equivalent to the 2006 ICC, which is International Codes Council standard. Columbia already is at the 2018 standard. We're not even at we're not even at 2023 standard. We're at 2018, but we're going to roll back to 2006 if they pass this. So far, it hasn't passed the Senate. So call your senators. And as you know, the best time to make a home efficient is when it's being built. Retrofitting is very expensive, and we have a chance at the beginning to keep energy use lower for the lifetime of the house. It's much more effective to have good R50, and the new standard, the standard they want to go back to is R16. We have an R50. That difference is bigger than having solar on your roof for the lifetime of your house. So if you would just do that much more insulation, you would be equivalent of keeping solar on your house. So it costs more money, let's be honest, right? But that savings that you would achieve by not using the energy, by saving the energy and not having to pay for it, would be repaid in 4 years. And so it's a lot more effective to get that in the initial mortgage cost and amortize it over 30 years than to have to go back and add it in later. The next one I'll talk about is, no, I have only one slide. Electric vehicle charging stations. I have a name for this, which is not floor or ceiling. I'm calling it a poison pill. So the electric vehicle charging station law, not a law yet, bill, has passed the House also. It is in the Senate. And what it says, if the local government imposes any requirement, so for a electric charging station, let's say you have a office complex coming up with 50 parking spaces, and it says 10% of your parking spaces should have infrastructure for supporting electric charging. The proposed law says that the city should pay for all of that infrastructure. So it will come out of the city's pocket, not the builder's pocket, not the developer's pocket, not the owner's pocket, but out of the city's pocket. So you can see that the city is not going to be willing to do this, while they might be willing to put a rule that says you should have 10% electric charging. They're not going to pay for it. So therefore, they're never going to pass any kind of restriction. So this is one example of the state preempting any local decisions in electric vehicle charging stations by putting what I'm calling a poison pill. And even worse, there are funds available in the new Infrastructure Act to support building these things, and we will not be able to access them if we don't set up some standards by which this is happening. If we have standards, we're able to access those funds. But without standards, it's a free-for-all, and Infrastructure Act doesn't support free-for-all. They're asking for some standards so that they support it. So another example of an attempt to preempt activities of local entities is ESG investing. ESG is environmental, social, and governance investing. And those are principles whereby public funds, when they're invested, should be considering these principles: environmental principles, social principles, and governance principles. And the state legislature wants to say you cannot consider any of these things when making your investments, which is silly, of course, because the impact on our investments from changes in the environment are real, and the impact on our investments from poor governance, like corruption in companies, is real. And if we're not allowed to think about these things, we'll have a real problem. It's not a made-up issue. This is very timely. All of you who are in Columbia, we're having a march. We, meaning the climate leaders at Mizzou, the student body, before Earth Day, the Friday before Earth Day, we're having a march to promote that the government will be doing ESG with, not the government, the university will be using ESG in the investment of their pension funds. So it is timely, and the legislature may have already picked up that other people are thinking about this, and they want to block it before it gets launched out. And the last example I want to give of preemption is, again, a different type. This is a preemption by the citizens, done through the initiative petition back in 1986. The state legislature did not want to tax the citizenry for a soils conservation project. The House was able to pass it, the Senate refused to pass it, but the citizens went ahead and were able to put it into the Constitution. The Constitution preempts any acts of the legislature, just like the federal Constitution preempts everything at all the levels, whether it's federal, state, or local. The US Constitution preempts all of that, but the state legislature is specifically preempted by the state constitution. So in 1986, they were able to pass a tax a 1/10 cent tax. Half of it goes to parks, half of it goes to soil conservation. And every 10 years, the citizenry has voted to renew and continue that tax. And it has generated $800 million for parks and $800 million for soil conservation. There's no other state in the country that has a dedicated funds for soil conservation. We went from being the worst in terms of soil conservation to one of the best states in soil conservation thanks to that tax. And it was recently meaning in 2016, approved again by 80% of Missourians. So you can see that things that the legislature didn't want to have happen, we, the citizens, have some power to preempt them if we keep the initiative petition, which will definitely be on the ballot in the near future, and they want to get rid of it or make it very, very difficult to use as a political tool. So I'm encouraging everybody to remember this when that vote comes up in the not so distant future. And now, Karl, will you take it away?
Well, thank you, Peter and Mahree. I'm going to approach this a little bit different. I've got another slide here, just a single slide. And first, I want to thank the League of Women Voters and the group, the committee that worked on this. I'm going to borrow pretty heavily from some of their notes in terms of what I'm going to say. My portion of this really has about 5 different categories. And I'll get into a little bit of the detail of those categories, and this is taken almost directly from that report. So if you want any more information, it has the RISMOs and it has all of the references and so on. So the first category, and my perspective is a very municipal perspective. I was joking that we not only ought to have the state flag up here, we ought to have the municipal flag up here when it comes to preemption. Mahree mentioned something about balance, and I'm going to leave the pros and cons up to you. I have some pretty strong opinions about this, but nonetheless, let's take a look at the first one. The first one, it has to do with education. The report suggested that the state prohibits any school district or charter school from allowing any person who is an abortion provider to offer, sponsor, or furnish in any manner any course materials or instruction related to human sexuality or STDs. It requires that abstinence be presented as the preferred choice of behavior in relation to all sexual activity. It seems like a pretty dated position, but nonetheless, that's where we are. It also prohibits any school district from setting an opening date earlier than 14 calendar days prior to the first Monday in September. Sets a minimum number of school days for all districts. So that's the education piece that the state has, in its wisdom, decided to advance. In terms of human resources, that deals with the minimum wage. Local governments are prohibited from requiring a minimum wage level or any other employment benefits, paid sick leave, insurance, etc., different from those set by the state. The law preempted and nullified all existing local ordinances, rules, and regulations. The third category, public health. This really deals with mask mandates and really gets into my experiences with COVID and so on. And this gets complicated because, no, that's right.
The wrong slide.
No, it's not.
No, it's right.
It's okay. It's a little bit different from the categories that are on the slide, but they relate. So the mask mandates here, this was particularly difficult because of the fact that Columbia is a charter community and the county is not, and the public health service had to dance a tightrope in order to negotiate how we were going to deal with COVID. But the state mandates restricts local health authorities' ability to pass emergency orders, ordinances, rules, etc. during an infectious disease emergency. It limits the time frame for such orders and requires a 2/3 majority vote of the local governing body in some circumstances, although it allows health orders to be terminated with a simple majority vote. Prohibits local governments from requiring proof of vaccination for access to public transportation or other public accommodation. The next category, firearms. There are two bullet points there. They all deal with the guns, essentially. The state prohibits local governments from regulating the possession, sale, transfer, or use of firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition. Prohibits local law enforcement from cooperating with federal agents to enforce federal firearms laws. Opens law enforcement agencies to lawsuits by anyone who feels their Second Amendment rights have been violated. And finally, there's a bullet there dealing with taxation. This deals with St. Louis and Kansas City. Prohibits any Missouri city or town that did not have an earnings tax in place as of 11/2/2010 from imposing such a tax in St. Louis City and Kansas City. Were allowed to keep their earnings taxes, but required to put them to a vote every 5 years. So I'll leave it up to you to what you think about how balanced this is in this state. There's a couple of interesting notes here that I thought, in addition to just some of the bullets that were on there. One is there's a take home. Yeah, there is only one. We don't need this as a slide.
Well, I'll do that.
You're
She'll
gonna come
do
back
the
to
last
that one.
one.
My bad.
The take-home message that I could, as best I can tell, is that preemption violates the conservative principle of local control. We hear about that a lot. This is a conservative principle, and yet it's only a conservative principle when the preemption tends to be politically acceptable, and that's a problem that we have in this state. Another issue that I dealt with specifically on the city council, and that is preemption has an insidious effect on the discussion and creation of local legislation. Regardless of whether it's specific, if it's specific, it's pretty clear. But it also tends to tamp down the discussion and the opportunity to even discuss some of these. I thought perhaps that we were going to talk a little bit about the plastic bag ban. That was 2015. I remember it very well. That's kind of an environmental issue. Yeah. But it was pretty clear what the state wanted to take up the interests of the grocery stores and the businesses and so on, and essentially short-circuited some of the environmental concerns that a lot of the community had. The other thing is, when we deal with some of the federal legislation, the ARPA funding and infrastructure funding and so on, when it's not specifically granted to the municipalities in order for them to spend money on their projects, the state has a kind of a throttle as to whether to forward some of those funds, as to whether or not it's in their interest that the cities are able to deal with some of the federal funding that they deem necessary. And they tend to hold back some of those funds because of some of the rural interests and so on. There was a recent controversy in the city council because of state preemption, and that had to do with the enforcement of the Officers' Bill of Rights, Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, and the CPRB, the Columbia Police Review Board. The CPRB thought that they ought to have an additional investigative authority, and the state thought that was a bad idea and advanced further rights for law enforcement, and I'll leave that up to you as to whether or not you thought those investigative rights were legitimate or not. But nonetheless, it created a lot of conflict with respect to the city's ability to deal with its own police review board and to sort these things out between the state legislature and the municipality. And most recently, last night I was watching the news, and you all know about the Tennessee 3, of course. But the thing that shocked me was, in addition to the fact that there's all kinds of racial overtones and not even overtones, it's just pretty clear. But the recent example in the news was that Nashville, in particular, has 3 state legislators. They're all Republican, even though that state has been gerrymandered to the extent that they get no representation, virtually no representation at all. There are 3 there is Republican control over Nashville. They're not all Republican state, and they've tried to marginalize them by getting rid of some of them. I misspoke. But the shocking thing that was reported was that this Tennessee state legislature has moved to reduce Nashville City Council by 1/2. So it's being reduced from 40 to 20. And I'm not that well versed in Tennessee state law, but I'm assuming that's because of the Dillon rule, the fact that they don't have a voice, and the state legislature can in fact mandate those kinds of rather radical measures on municipalities. Nashville is kind of the Columbia of Tennessee, I guess.
Or the Chicago.
Or the Chicago of Illinois. And finally, I just wanted to mention there's a lot of resources here. The report that the League of Women Voters produced had a tremendous amount of resources. One stood out to me because I was pretty active in the National League of Cities. And this has been the topic du jour in the National League of Cities for a long, long time. They have several resources. One is called Preemption 101. There's a fascinating bar graph on here that has the total number of states preempted by policy in terms of subject area. Firearms, for example, there are 45 states that have preemption restrictions on firearms. Rideshare, 37 states. Rent control, 29 states. Paid leave, 20 states. Minimum wage, 15 states. It goes on and on. Ban the box, 7 states. I mean, there's all kinds of, but a lot of these resources are tremendous resources in case anybody wants to get involved in any of the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you. If anyone, I know we're probably going to have questions, so we'll speed up this last part. But if anyone is interested in reading the whole report, just let me know. I'll be more than happy to provide a copy.
So you have an email copy?
Yeah. I won't go through all of these. I just wanted you to see that in our current legislative session, these are proposals, preemptive proposals. Peter mentioned that construction standards, that there's a bill to ban all fees on public streets. So in other words, it would make parking free everywhere in the state, regardless of, even around the state capitol, it's impossible to park as it is now, but that would make a real free-for-all. Prohibit eviction moratoriums, prohibit requiring a home inspection before the home is sold, prohibit local regulation of veterinary practice, which Karl told me had something to do with declawing cats. I guess some municipality wanted to do that. And of course, all the major discussions about banning school curricula, taking away local control to determine school curricula and library books and athletic policies regarding LGBTQ plus people. So it's real and it keeps snowballing. It seems like just the number of things they keep trying to do. So with that,
we're done with the PowerPoint. Okay. All right, Dave, PowerPoint is done. Get this out here so we can all see one another. Okay. And I couldn't see any of this chat when we were talking.
wow.
Let's see here.
Yeah, it's gonna be hard to piece it together.
Okay, I think we're good. So if you're watching on Zoom and you have a question, if you would please type that in the chat, or if you are unable to do that, maybe raise your hand, because I can hear you in my headphones, but the room cannot hear you unless I repeat your question. And with that,
Anybody in the room have any questions?
Peter has a question.
I have a question. So, is it legal for them to say that we can't cooperate with federal gun laws? Can they preempt the
Well,
federal laws?
the default is court decided, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if there's an argument
It's
here
being pursued.
between these different methods and so far, and that too is kind of it's almost an insidious sort of form of preemption, because that can cause delay and so on.
Tie everybody up.
Tie
in
everybody
court.
up.
But yeah, it is being tested in the courts.
Yeah.
And from what little I know of constitutional law, I think it's probably totally illegal.
Yeah.
But it's been in effect. It will be in effect until it gets overturned. And with our current U.S. Supreme Court, who knows?
And that's particularly difficult because local law enforcement often depends upon federal law enforcement in certain cases certain cases that they have to deal with. And this is almost a hands-off of being able to cooperate, so.
Even share information.
Right, let's see if we can field this question from Dave Rayful. Dave, if you want to go ahead and speak.
It wasn't a question. I thought there was something to Peter's question. Unless something has changed, I thought the status of the SAPA right now is
Unless
federal
something has
judge has
changed,
struck.
he thought the status of the SAPA is.
Oh,
Keep going.
never mind.
Never mind. It's too hard to explain. If you want to type it in the chat, if you've got enough fingers to type it in the chat, Dave, I can read it out to the room and they can see the chat. Everyone in the room can see the chat behind
All right.
me on a big screen. Sorry about that.
I don't know what SAPA is.
It's too small.
I can read it out too. Yeah, it's little.
Okay.
I don't think we've missed.
ESG.
Yeah.
Somebody asked if Peter could say one more time what ESG
Yeah,
is.
E is environmental, S is social, and G is governance. And these are principles that people use when making investing decisions.
For instance,
In other words, who do
years
you-
ago, South Africa.
Right, that
What-
was part of it.
Apartheid,
That
yeah.
was,
So, yeah,
that was a
apartheid,
social principle to end apartheid, and that came under the S of ESG.
And there are
Tobacco
funds,
and Also.
there are specific funds you can invest in that, for example, do not contain any tobacco stocks or do not contain any petroleum stocks.
I see 3 questions on Zoom. Winifred, do you want to go ahead and state your question and then I'm going to repeat it for the speakers.
Okay. I'd like to comment that
You'd like to
on
comment?
the
On the-
building code standards, it'd be particularly bad for that bill to pass
It was
because
particularly bad for that bill to
that would,
pass. She's probably getting a weird background as I repeat this. Sorry, keep going. You're good.
it would be bad for the building
bad
code
The
rollback,
building code
fast.
rollback,
HB 580,
HB 580,
because
because
it would, right now,
They
federal funds available for cities that move to adopt a stricter standard, the
cities
current
that do it
international
stricter
code
in the current
in
international
any
code
state. So
prevented.
if they pass this bill, no city in Missouri would be able to move up to these better standards that would help limit climate change and help reduce energy bills, and lose access to these funds that have already been approved, to be distributed to the states.
So it was more of a comment than a question that as you had sort of hinted at, Peter, but she elaborated more, that if we limit with a ceiling what the building codes that could be passed and like with the environmental concerns, it obviously really hampers our ability to fight climate change, and that we even have some things in place already to collect money and to pay for these things that now can't even be used because it's been tamped down. Did I get the gist of it, Wen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. The sound situation's a little tricky today.
Is it in the House or the Senate? Who do we
It
send?
passed the House,
Okay,
it's
so
now
we
in the
need to
Senate.
contact Bill Broughton,
So
So
Caleb
it's
Brown,
going to the Senate then.
yeah.
580.
580.
House Bill 580.
I'm just going to go in the order I see you up on the screen. David Luhold, do you want to state your question?
Yes, I had the question about the Missouri Constitutional Amendment to the state parks tax and conservation tax. What is the situation on that? Is the legislature threatening to eliminate that re-election or what?
He's wondering about the state parks tax. Is that under any kind of a threat?
Oh, yes.
But it comes up for vote every 10 years. And
And we-
so again, it will be there in 2026. But like I said, in 2016, it passed with 80%. So as long as we do our democratic duty and show up to vote, it should remain in place.
So David, he was using that, I think, as an example of when citizens were able to really get something done, that the government wasn't a priority for them, but it was a priority for citizens. And I think that was just used as an example. It's not in any kind of danger right now, particularly
But the
specific danger.
importance is that initiative petition is in danger.
Yeah,
And we used initiative petition to make this happen.
you follow, David? Did I answer your concern? Okay, he says yes.
This wasn't the legislature trying to take over that money.
Well, they're not allowed to because of the
Because it is
Constitution.
in the Constitution, yeah. And I think that was another key point that Peter made, is that that's the reason we have these constitutional amendments in Missouri, because it's the only way for the citizenry to pass something that the legislature can't then turn around and undo.
Which they're
Not
trying to
easily.
do every time.
Yeah.
You know?
Now, they may put it back on the ballot again and again, like they've done with right to work, for
Right.
example.
Beat us with it over the head repeatedly.
Which is why they're trying to change the initiative petition.
And make it harder.
Exactly.
Hurd, you ready to ask your question?
Yes, I commend you for efforts to approach this question of individual rights versus local government rights versus state rights versus national rights as if it were a philosophical question. Others have tried to do this too over time, from the Federalist, Anti-Federalist papers on. However, issues frequently trump. Can you identify for me any individual whom you know, and we would know, any state, any local government, or indeed a national government that has embraced a consistent principle of preemption or rights across all issues?
Across all issues. So you're asking if there's a place where this is like a really bad problem and they just.
No, I'm asking whether it's a problem everywhere. I'm asking, is there any place that anybody's ever got it worked out halfway well?
And is there any place that they've managed to work it out halfway well? Well, on behalf of not allowing the stealings and such? Are you asking if there's a place that we could model a good balanced
I'm
approach
just
after
asking
her?
if anyone's ever seen one. I haven't.
If anyone's ever seen a good balanced approach, I
It's
believe.
not possible because, as Mark pointed out, there are situations where we want preemption. For example, the federal rules that gave civil rights, that would have never happened if we didn't have the federal rule preempting local Jim Crow laws. So it's a balance. There's no situation where we can say it's definitely bad or definitely good. Sometimes it's valuable. It depends on your position and are you being the one preempted or not?
Yeah, if you speak loudly, everybody can hear you.
Are there any organizations, think tanks or whatever, that are providing the script for the state governments that want to preempt to the detriment by our standards? But are there think tanks that are kind of helping them?
There are,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
And can you name, I mean, are there some?
Well, ALEC is the obvious.
Okay.
Heritage.
Which is the
Yeah.
Koch
association,
brothers.
Yeah.
what's the acronym?
Legislative.
Association of Legislators.
American Legislative something Council.
Executive
Right,
Council.
that's
Executive.
what-
There we go. Yeah, Dave Brinkle said the same thing in chat. Dave
Alec.
also, Dave also posted in chat, SAPA has been ruled unconstitutional. Somebody tell me what SAPA is. What is that?
I don't know.
It's been ruled unconstitutional by a
It's the
federal.
Second Amendment Protection Act. That is.
Oh.
Second Amendment, thank you.
Okay, that's
Has been ruled unconstitutional by a federal circuit judge. He's enjoined his own ruling so that the state can appeal.
Yeah.
So SAPA is in effect. The next move is the Constitutional Sheriff Yosemite Sam Empowerment Act, making every sheriff the king of the county. I think.
Oh, no.
But Alice, I see your hand is up.
It was actually just a statement on guns. I was with moms and talked to David Tyson for a while. So look forward to a hearing that says we can start carrying concealed weapons on buses.
Yeah.
Alice says they were just at the Capitol talking to Representative Tyson Smith, who said he's sees a bill coming up through that would allow concealed carry on buses.
And possibly subways.
And possibly subways and other kinds of public transportation, I guess.
we had. Good, we don't.
Other questions? I don't think I see any on the Zoom.
Alice.
Oh, here's one in the room. Alice got one.
Does being a charter city or a home rule county provide any kind of protection that you wouldn't get if you weren't one of those?
Did you hear the question at
Yeah.
home?
Yeah.
Not
In
not
short,
very
yes.
well.
The question was, does having a charter offer you some protections? The charter, like the city of Columbia has and the county does not have. Does the city enjoy some kind of protections was the question.
It does, but I think it also means it's not foolproof because they can pass a law that completely preempts that area of concern to the state level. But it does provide much more latitude, I think. We
And
should agree.
this is one of those areas, I think, that some of this is kind of insidious. That is, the business about tamping down the discussion and the ability of local municipalities and local governments to provide some creative solutions. The home rule and the chartered form of government gives you a bit more authority, but you still have to pick and choose your battles, because if you get into a very controversial issue, the state will get pretty agitated and come down pretty hard, which tends to reduce the amount of reasonable discussion that you can have.
And I think they also can make it difficult in other ways, apply political pressure in other ways, indirectly. But yeah, a county like ours that does not have a home rule charter is really completely at the mercy of the state legislature.
A good example, it has a funding mechanism, which is whether or not to reduce funding for particular areas. Instead of putting it specifically in the ordinances, they can just reduce the funding stream.
I'm trying to connect the dots between the speakers we had last week on the marijuana tax and what you're saying now. And it came out in the discussion last week that the reason the county could pass the tax is because it was a constitutional amendment, because if it wasn't a constitutional amendment, then they would have to go through the legislature and get them to say, you may pass a tax, and then they would pass the tax. So now this is making that more clear to me why that was. This discussion today.
And one important preemptive bill that we have not mentioned is the whole fight over local prosecutors, and the fact that the state legislature is now trying to take over prosecution of cases in, I think, any jurisdiction in Missouri by appointing its own prosecutors for major crimes. And completely circumvent the local elected officials who are the prosecutors. And it started out, they were just going to do it in St. Louis, and it was purely, obviously political and racial. But I guess they were told they couldn't get by with that, so then they made it universal, but at their discretion, so they could still pick and choose whose prosecutorial power to take over. Now that hasn't passed yet, but.
Dave Taylor in chat, or Dave Rafel in the chat says, for the record, he's going back to last week's topic. He's seen receipts at this point. The city and the county are collecting the ordinary sales tax on both recreational and medical marijuana. So the extra 6% that passed is going to be likely be stacked on top of the standard sales tax. So it's really going to be more like 7 something.
Although Kip Kendrick was quoted in the newspaper as saying that the county would only collect the tax in the unincorporated areas.
Oh, really?
So,
okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's just what I read.
It's going to go to court.
Yeah. It will.
Yeah. I think it's also in the legislature to prevent schools from insisting that COVID vaccine be mandated in schools, along with the other ones are okay.
Okay, we're going to try something different. I'm going to take out my headphone. Herb, I'm going to call on you, and then I'm going to yank my headphone cord, and we're going to see if we can hear you here in the room. So go for it.
Okay, a half-baked follow-up to my earlier half-baked question. If in fact, individuals and various units of government are hopelessly inconsistent in whether they embrace states' rights, local rights, whatever, or the alternative, depending on the issue at hand, how can a group such as Muleskinners, or the Boone County Democratic Party, or the Missouri Democratic Party, or the National, adopt a position on preemption that will be other than a self-serving proposition for a particular question, particular issue? How can we do better than the
What
nullifier?
the league did was to say that there's
He's
certain
still talking.
type. Oh,
I'm so sorry. I thought he was done. Go ahead. Go ahead.
what the local league decided to do was to adopt the position that I gave earlier, which is that we oppose certain kinds of preemption, namely ceiling preemption, but not all preemption. But it's admittedly not, it's just not a cut and dry, black and white kind of thing.
The other thing, the other group is the National League of Cities, which has been on top of this for a long time, and with advocacy groups and panels and so on and so forth, and lots of resources. But there are groups out there that are dealing with this issue, and that's one of them.
What's their position? I mean,
Well, they're the National League of Cities is very concerned that the preemption is a rather insidious way to control.
But are
or
they
to stifle.
offering like the league did? Do they have any statement?
They do. One of the resources was a couple of these white papers. And so the same kind of thing that the league is doing on a national level with the municipalities, and affects some 17,000 municipalities.
So they're just saying, they're just concerned. I mean, that it is a serious concern.
And they fight it with
And
their
they're
lobbying, you know, and, excuse me, advocate.
And making recommendations on a federal level and state levels. And the other group is the municipal league, of course, which is also involved in defending municipality.
Any other questions in the room? Any other questions on Zoom? I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Peter, you were talking about the Friday before Earth Day. Would you send me that information so that I can put it in?
Pam's asking a question
And to
about
Scott as well.
getting the March on
Peter,
the
where do you
calendar.
live, you think? You don't.
Okay, so I think at this point, we're going to move to the regular business meeting, which would be very short. Really, it's just going to be announcements this week, I believe. And let me see if I am smart enough to do this correctly this time. I believe it was